everyone, welcome to lecture 2 in the series. This is the one where we really get going. So I thought I'd start with a quote by Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Austrian oak, the one and only. One of his pieces of advice for life and for success: break the rules. Right, I start with that because you all seem hell-bent on breaking the rules. So to be clear, I'm not talking about breaking the law. In this lecture series, we talk about foundational business law concepts to help entrepreneurs interface better with their legal professionals and their lawyers and run their businesses more effectively. So we're not talking about breaking the law. Don't do that. We're talking about breaking, or at least playing around with the rules. All right, we get it. You're entrepreneurs. You're at the cutting edge. And like Arnie says, you're going to be breaking some of the rules. Sure. What's he talking about here? Well, presumably he's talking about challenging the status quo, thinking outside the box, maybe acting like a maverick. That's fine. That's cool. I get it. But you have to understand the rules first, right? So we're going to get into that today. We're going to be talking about the essential rules of business law, the legal basics. If you understand them, you'll be able to think on your own and start playing around with the rules, right? But if you have no idea about the stuff we're going to teach you in this lecture and you think you're some kind of maverick, then you're a dick and you will get yourself into trouble, all right? So let's get into it. The law understands two things, just two. It puts everything that it deals with in terms of business law into two buckets. What are those buckets? All right. Well, they are legal persons and they are natural persons. Just two buckets. That's it. All right. So you've got legal persons and natural persons. All right. So we're going to start with the simplest one, natural persons. Right. So what are natural persons? Well, that's you. They're human beings. That's it. Human beings. Flesh and blood, stick man's back. Maybe it's our Russian oligarch from the last lecture. Who knows? But this is a natural person. Flesh and blood, skin and bones, human beings. It's your mind, it's your body, it's your actions. If you start doing business and you don't register a company or a legal person or some legal entity, you're doing business as a natural person by default. It's fine. It's completely legal. The law will just assume that if you start doing some business without setting up a company or some type of legal person, then you're doing it automatically by default as a natural person, okay? It's not necessarily advisable, but you can do it. It's the default legal position of anyone doing anything in business if you haven't registered a company or legal entity, all right? Okay, so that's natural persons, very simple. It's human beings, all right? In this lecture, we're going to be looking at legal persons, right? And you can consider these the tools, right, in your toolkit, okay? So legal persons are the tools in your toolkit. Legal persons are created by the law. They exist only on paper. They have to act through natural persons, but legal persons, according to the law, absolutely do exist. So if you want to proceed in the world and do business, you can either start doing it and register nothing, then you're doing it as a natural person, or you can use one of the legal tools that we will go through today. All right, we're calling these legal persons tools for two reasons, all right? I want you to think of them as tools for two reasons now. The first reason is that they're the way that the law lets you do business stuff, all right? That's the first reason why. And the second reason why is that not all of these tools are legal persons on their own. Okay, so don't worry if that doesn't make sense now. It will as we go through. All right, so you have natural persons and legal persons. We're focusing on legal persons. Natural persons are just human beings, right? The law then divides up broadly legal persons into two broad categories. They are separate legal entities, and they are relationships. All right, so you've got two broad categories. You've got legal persons, separate legal entities, and relationships. And then you've got natural persons, right? This is the bucket we're focusing on. These are your tools. The law divides it down into two categories further, right? So in this category, separate legal persons, you have two main tools that you can use. Two main tools. They are companies and they are foundations, right? Foundations, okay? And then you've got relationships, right? So these are legal relationships. These are partnerships, right? Partnerships, and everyone's favorite, trusts. Okay. Separate legal entities and relationships. Companies and foundations, relationships, trusts and partnerships. These are the four main legal tools that we are going to go through today. All right, the first thing to establish, why does the law do this? Why does it separate the tools in your toolkit between separate legal persons and relationships, right? So it does it, remember the last lecture, to allow you to divide up ownership, control, and benefit. The lectures build on each other, guys, so if you haven't watched the last one, please go back and do it. But to review, ownership is not one thing. It is a bundle of things, right? It is ownership, control, and benefit. And the law allows you to divide out ownership, control, and benefit, to separate it out. Okay, so that's why the law separates your tools between separate legal entities and relationships, so you can effectively divide up ownership, control, and benefit. Really important to remember, confusing natural persons, legal persons, or separate legal entities and relationships can cause real problems. So we're going to make this very, very clear and very basic for everyone so you can understand and not get yourself into trouble. All right, so let's go into each of the four tools that you have available to do business in the world, right? Please, guys, a caveat here. Remember, we're teaching basic business law concepts, right? This is to help business people interact with their lawyers better. Obviously, things are more nuanced. They will vary depending on the country you're in, where you do business. We're teaching principles here. So this knowledge will work wherever you are. All right, let's get into the first one. Companies. All right. Companies are separate legal persons. They are separate to their owners. This is very important to understand. Some of these tools will be separate legal persons, and some of them will be natural persons in relationships. This will make more sense as we go along. I really want to emphasize, a company is a separate legal person. What does that mean? I keep saying it. I keep trying to drill it home. It means when it's registered, it's like giving birth to a baby, right? There is a new legal thing in the world that is not you. The company goes into the world, it grows, it goes out on its own. If it's successful as it grows up, just like a child growing up, anything it owns is not yours. It does not belong to you. It doesn't matter if you own 100% of the company. Anything that the company owns belongs to it, not you. This is absolutely key to understand. It is separate, right? That's the main thing to know about companies. Okay, we're going to go into trust now. All right, so this is another legal tool you have, trusts. No doubt you've heard of them. A trust is not a separate legal person. A company is a separate thing to you. A trust is not, right? A trust is a relationship between parties. It is not a legal person on its own. A trust is a relationship of trust, right? So if it's not a legal person or not a separate legal person and it's a relationship, then who's a relationship between? Excuse me. All right, so let's draw it. It's a relationship between three parties, right? Remember, there can be more parties. We're dealing with foundational concepts here. So it is a relationship between three parties, basically. Who are they? The trustee, the settlor, and the beneficiary. All right, there you go. So what is a relationship? This is a trust. Right? That is the trust. It is the relationship between the trustee, the settlor, and the beneficiary. Right? Okay, that is the trust. The reason you will see trust used a lot is because it breaks the chain of title, right? Okay, I want you to think for a second. With a company, ownership has to end somewhere, right? If you have a company, who owns that company, right? It has to be either a natural person or another company, right? Then if it's another company, who owns that company? A natural person or another company. It goes on and on. It's a recursive problem. It goes on forever. A trust helps you break that chain of title. It solves that recursive problem. Eventually, you're going to have to hit with ownership a natural person at some point. Natural people have a core problem at law. They die, right? That's when things get messy. So a trust is a relationship. It's a tool, and it's one of the very few tools that lets you stop that endless chain. Okay? So let's break it up. Let's show you how we divide up ownership, control, and benefit in the trust relationship, and we'll demonstrate to you how it solves that recursive problem. Right? So a quick disclaimer, I guess it's time to say this, is that not every country has trusts, right? But most are going to have some version that does the same basic thing. What's that? They're going to have something in their law that allows you to divide up ownership, control, and benefit and break the recursive ownership problem, right? A lot of jurisdictions have trusts to do it. A lot of you will be familiar with them. We'll go through it so you can learn the principles, right? Let's divide it up. Benefit. Where does benefit go? It's in the name. Benefit is divided. It goes to the beneficiary, right? Okay. In the trust relationship, who gets control? The trustee gets control of the assets. Okay. And then, who gets ownership? Okay, so this is why trust is a trust is a very unique tool. This is it. This is at the core, right? Because it lets you split the O, right? So you remember from our last lecture, again, ownership is a bundle of three things: ownership, control, and benefit. You can unbundle it and divide it up between different different legal entities and actors, right? But then a trust does something special. It allows you to then divide up again the O, right? Remember, the ownership is not one thing. A trust lets you divide the O even further. All right, so what are you dividing it into? You're dividing it into two concepts, right? You're dividing it into title. So we know title, that's who's written on the register or on the share certificate, right? And then you're transferring to ultimate beneficial ownership, right? You may have heard that before. So we take the O and we divide it up into two concepts and we split it up. So B, benefit, goes to the beneficiary. Control goes to the trustee. Then we send title, one of the O's, to the trustee, right? And then we send the other O here, ultimate beneficial ownership, to the beneficiary. That's it. So you've divided up the O. I hope that makes sense, right? So that is why you'll see your favorite influencer flexing on you with their fancy structure, right? And you'll keep seeing trusts at the top of that, or usually you will see a trust at the top of these super fancy rich people diagrams, right? It's not magic. It's because it allows you to divide up the O and break the recursive chain of ownership problem. Trusts are simply a tool to divide the O. Okay, so we haven't talked about the settler. So what about the settler? So the settler is the one that transfers the assets, right? Now, where are the assets transferred to? Remember, title. You can't transfer the assets to the trust because the trust doesn't exist. It's not a separate legal entity. A trust is a relationship. So the settler is the one that transfers the assets, the company or the properties or the gold bars or whatever, to the trustee. Remember, when you're setting up your trust, the settler is the one that transfers the assets to the trustee. The trustee has the title, this O, right? Okay, and then after the assets are transferred, generally, the settler has no role. Ownership, title, and control are with the trustee. Ownership, ultimate beneficial ownership, and benefit are with the beneficiary. That's it. The settler is done, right? Important to remember, if the settler controls the trust, still, in reality, even if they've transferred the title, right? Remember from our last lecture, then the trust will be considered bullshit by the legal system. It doesn't matter if you transfer the title and ownership. If you maintain control in reality, regardless of what the paperwork says, then the law will just see through it. You have to give up control if you're the settler, settling your trust and setting it up. No one's going to be tricked, right? You actually have to give up the control to the trustee. That's why it works. Okay, so we've done companies, we've done trusts. We'll go back to the separate legal entities and we'll talk about foundations now. Okay, so when I say a foundation, I'm not talking about something like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example. What I'm talking about is foundations that are kind of like trusts and also kind of like companies. All right, so that's confusing. What does that mean? I get it. All right, so you can think of a foundation as basically the mutant legal love child of a company and a trust, right? It's like a mashup of both. You create this new, interesting third thing. So a foundation is a legal person, just like a company. It's a separate legal entity, right? It can own assets on its own, in its own name. In that way, it's exactly like a company. But like a trust, it's not really owned by anyone. A foundation separates ownership, control, and benefit between parties, just like a trust, right? And in that way, it also breaks the recursive ownership problem. All right, so let's draw a foundation. Basic foundation, so you can see why it's kind of like a trust. It'll look like a trust, but it's also kind of like a company. Let's see it, partnerships. Okay, so you've got three actors in your foundation, right? You've got the foundation itself, the entity, right? You've got a council, right? And then you've got beneficiaries, sometimes called recipients or qualified recipients. The names will vary slightly between countries and jurisdictions, but the principles are the same. This is a foundation, right? This is how we break the recursive problem of ownership, like a trust, but we also create something that's a bit like a company. Okay, so let's go back. From our last lecture, ownership is ownership, control, and benefit. Let's divide it up. Ownership. Who gets ownership? The foundation gets ownership. Remember, the foundation is a separate legal entity, right? It's an entity on its own, like a company. It can own things in its own name. So you transfer assets to the foundation. The foundation owns them. Who gets control, right? Control goes to the council, right? There is a document, an internal governing document that dictates the direction of the foundation and the rules by which it will be run and the reason that it exists. The body, the party that is responsible for executing on that internal document and for maintaining it is the council. They have control, right? So that's control, the control element. Who gets benefit? Benefit goes to the beneficiaries, right? So you've divided up ownership, control, and benefit. Right, okay, so a foundation parks ownership in a separate legal person, right? But in that way, it's like a company, but unlike a company, this legal person has no shareholders, so it breaks the recursive ownership problem. It divides up control and benefit. It gives control to a governing body and sets out benefit as defined by rules administered by this governing body. Okay, beautiful. We've done foundations. These are all the tools in your toolkit for doing business, right? Let's go on to partnerships. Partnership is also a legal tool. It's a tool for doing business together, but it's not a separate person. It's a relationship, right? In plain terms, a partnership is two or more persons or entities. To keep it simple, it's two or more natural persons, right? In a relationship doing some activity. All right, so there we go, stickman again. So this is a partnership. You've got a relationship. There we go. Partnership is basically two or more humans or entities, and they agree to do some business activity for a profit, hopefully, maybe for a loss. So the partnership name might appear on the invoices or the contracts, but the partnership itself isn't a standalone legal person. It's not. It's a relationship, right? The partners individually, as natural persons, are the business. They are the business individually. All right, the big practical takeaway and implication that matters most for partnerships is that the partners can owe money and get sued personally as natural persons, right? Because they become liable personally if anything goes wrong with their business, okay? So, important so I don't get shit from any lawyers who are watching this. In some jurisdictions, there are concepts like limited liability partnership, for example. So there are partnerships with some separate company-like features, right? But to keep it foundational or to keep it conceptual, the beginner rule is a basic partnership is not a separate legal person. It's a relationship between natural persons. All right. They are your full tools in your toolkit that allow you to do business in the world. They are the core rules, right? To review, the law divides everything into two buckets. It understands natural persons and legal persons. Natural persons are human beings. Legal persons, it divides up into two broad categories: separate legal entities and legal relationships. These are the tools in your toolkit that allow you to do business, right? Separate legal entities are companies and foundations. Legal relationships are trusts and partnerships. Why does the law do that? Because it allows you to unbundle ownership into ownership, control, and benefit. Okay, the two unique tools that you have in your toolkit that allow you to break it up even further are trusts and foundations. Trusts and foundations allow you to break up the O into title and ultimate beneficial ownership. By doing that, you break the recursive ownership problem, and then you don't need a natural person at the end of your chain who will die and cause problems, right? Okay, important things to remember now when you're doing these things with your lawyers and executing on these structures and building the business and the structure of your dreams that will serve you. I hear people all the time and they'll use sloppy language when they talk about their money or their assets or their structures. It's very important to understand these are silly people. Don't be silly, all right? Language actually matters. The words you use matter to the law, right? So imagine an entrepreneur does really well and he buys some property or some companies or some assets, and he sets up a trust or a foundation properly, all right? So it's all good so far. But then you'll talk to him and you'll hear him say things like, my apartment or my building or my villa, right? That's wrong. He doesn't own the asset. It's not his. You use that kind of language in the wrong context and you can do serious damage. Don't do it. All right. In a trust setup, for example, he's probably maybe the settler. That means that he's given up control, right? He's given up ownership. He's given up control of the assets. Now, he might still receive some benefit somewhere in the structure, and we'll get into that in future lectures. But in terms of ownership and control, if he's moved his assets to the trustee, if he's moved control to the trustee, right, he is not the owner of the assets. It's not his asset anymore, right? Remember, the law will ignore structures. It ultimately doesn't care. The law cares about behavior and how you're acting. Reality overrides paperwork. You'll enjoy the advantages of these structures if you act and speak properly. Companies and foundations, for example, are separate. All right, so we're going to summarize again. There are 4 primary types of legal tools that apply across jurisdictions in some form. They are companies, foundations, trusts, and partnerships. All right, they are just tools. It's like a toolbox. First think, what am I actually trying to achieve? What's the end result I want in basic terms? Then you pick the appropriate tool. You can imagine a craftsman, for example, in a workshop. He doesn't walk in, grab a hammer, and then ask himself, what am I going to build with a hammer? That's stupid, obviously. He decides what he wants to make first. Maybe he wants a bench or a table or a chair. Then after that, he will choose his tool. Legal entities and structures work the same way. Companies, trusts, foundations, partnerships are not the end goal. Don't ask, should I get a trust? Ask, what am I trying to achieve? These are just tools. Don't start by picking the tool. You'll force the design to fit, and then you will run into problems. If you start with the outcome you want, the right structure and the right tools will become obvious. Decide what you're building first, then choose the legal tool.